Today's class we will study about the transport in plants. So here in this chapter we'll study how the water is reaching the top of the tall trees and how the movement of all these substances from one cell to the other cell is happening, and whether these molecules are moving in same direction or in opposite direction, or whether this molecule requires any energy or doesn't require any energy. So what is the distance to travel from the roots to the shoot system? All these we'll study in this chapter, right? So for transport in plants we are studying in two different types. First is the short distance transport and the second one is the long distance transport. So short distance transport involves all the diffusion, osmosis and facilitated diffusion and plasmolysis. When we are talking about the long distance transport, then definitely it will come about the transport over long distances, which is through the vascular systems, right? And that transport which is proceeding through the vascular system, that is from the xylem or the phloem, is called as translocation, right? It's called as translocation. It's given here, as it is the important like the movement of substances is very much important here, so that all the processes, metabolic processes which are taking place in a plant should be carried out periodically, right? Besides these all transport systems, in a flowering plant also the water should be transported, like all apart from the water, all the minerals, right? Apart from the water, like mineral nutrients, organic nutrients, all the plant growth regulators, or like all those should be transported from the one place to other place, over by the process of by diffusion or by cytoplasmic streaming or by unidirectional movement or in a multidirectional movement. So let us study what are all these in this chapter. Okay, let us start with the diffusion. Like the particle movement through the diffusion is always passive. Like a movement maybe from one part of the cell to the other part, or from the cell to cell, or over we can say the short distances, or in between the cells to the outside. This is always passive. Passive in the sense there is no requirement of energy. That is, no energy is used when the molecules are passing from one cell to the other cell. There is no expenditure is taking place here, right? And here the molecules will always move in a random fashion. Random fashion means they will move wherever the space is required, where the concentration. That means what is the proper definition for the diffusion? If we see here, okay, I'm drawing a beaker here where I have drawn the concentrated, like where the moment of where the more concentration of particles is there, and here very less. So how the particles are moving from the higher concentration to the lower concentration? That is, this is the diffusion pressure, like movement of particles from the higher concentrated area to the lower concentration area. This is what we are calling it as diffusion. That is, from higher concentration to the regions of lower concentration. So this type of reaction where the concentration is very high and the movement of particles is going through down is called as downhill reaction. Like here you see this, the concentration is very high and moving down, because wherever the concentration is less. So how the arrow here is, it's going down. So that kind of a reaction is called as downhill reaction. And also it moves on the basis of pressure. Like what pressure? Here the diffusion in this beaker, in A beaker and in B beaker, in between I have drawn a line that is nothing but this is the semi-permeable membrane, right? So how the diffusion pressure in A beaker? It is very much, it's more, diffusion pressure is more in case of A beaker, whereas in case of B beaker the diffusion pressure is less, right? So how will be the pressure? It depends. The movement of molecules will depend on the basis of diffusion pressure also. Where the concentration is more, the particles will move where the diffusion pressure. The means of transport doesn't require any energy, then we can say it is independent of all the other living systems. Like how it does not depend on any other movement. It does not depend on any other living system for its movement. When the particles are moving from high concentration to the low concentration, that doesn't depend on other particles, right? All these diffusion rates, like movement of particles are called as diffusion rates, are affected by many factors. Like first thing is the concentration, which is present more in this A beaker, and The second one is the permeability membrane here, which I have drawn here. This is the permeability membrane. Okay, that also plays an important role when the diffusion rate is affecting. And also the external factors like temperature and pressure. So we can see that diffusion rates are more affected by the rate of concentration, that is in change in temperature, pressure, and also because of the permeability membrane as well. Right, this is clear. Next we'll move on for the facilitated diffusion. Okay, when we are talking about the facilitated diffusion, here the carrier protein is required. This is also a passive process, like as we have discussed in diffusion. Facilitated diffusion means it's a type of diffusion where a carrier protein is required. Carrier protein is required so that the molecules are moving from one cell to the other cell or from one region to the other region. They need a carrier. They need a carrier like a for the movement of particles or for the movement of here the molecules. So this is also a kind of a passive process where the energy is not required. Same thing as the molecules are moving from higher concentration to the lower concentration, and hence what it is, the type of reaction, then it is also a downhill reaction. Okay, it is also a downhill reaction. This is called downhill reaction. Why? Because the molecules are moving from higher concentration to the lower concentration, and then it has a saturation effect. Now what is meant by that saturation effect? Saturation effect means like the number of carrier proteins. Number of carrier proteins. As I told, the molecules to move from one place to another place, it needs a carrier. So that number of carrier proteins will be having a will decide the rate of diffusion. Means to say that number of molecules, number of carrier proteins. How many carrier proteins are there? Those many molecules only can transfer, right? Like see, so in case of this, here it is given. Membrane proteins provide sites at which such molecules cross the membrane, right? And they do not set up any concentration gradient. Like in case of facilitated diffusion, special proteins will help the substance to move across the membranes without the expenditure of ATP. Then that's just now I told, it is a passive process and the energy is not required, and hence it is a called as facilitated diffusion. Okay, let us see here to understand the facilitated diffusion phenomena and by using a carrier, like, right. You can see the plasma membrane here, how the molecules are moving from one place to the other place. Now this is the transport proteins. These are the transport proteins which are acting as carriers to transport the molecules from one cell, one region to the other region, right? See, this is the outer portion, outer side of the cell, and here is the inner side of the cell. So how the molecules are carried by this carrier? One molecule, one carrier. Here see, transported and hence reached inside the cell. Now this transport rate, like one molecule will number of carrier proteins will decide the rate of diffusion. Okay, now this I understood. Facilitated diffusion. In this, the transport rate will reach to a maximum when all the proteins transporters, okay, this will called as carrier protein or transport protein or protein transporters. When all these protein transporters are being used for transporting the molecules, that particular maximum level, we call it as saturation. Call it as saturation, right? Now, this type of diffusion, that is facilitated diffusion, is very specific. Why? Because it allows the cells to select the substances. It will select the substances and then only it will uptake. And also it is very sensitive for the inhibitors because it reacts with the protein side chains. So here you can see that these protein channels, these channels or the transport proteins are forming a channels. These transport proteins or whatever we call it as carrier proteins, are forming a channels in the membrane so that the molecules can pass through. Okay, now sometimes these channels can always be open, or sometimes they can be closed. That means they can be controlled, they will control themselves. Some are very large so that they can allow the molecules to cross through, and some are very small, right? And in case of plasma membrane, they contain a channel called as porins. Now these porins are protein in nature, okay, and that form the huge pores in the outer membranes. Like in case of these are the special porins called as aquaporins. Aquaporins means, aqua means water, okay. Porins are the pores made of proteins which will allow the, which are huge pores in the membranes of like mitochondria, or in case of plasmids or some bacteria. They will allow the molecules up to the size of small proteins that can pass through. Okay. Right, here this figure will show the extramolecular bound to the transport protein. Okay, what happens once the molecule is transporting through this transport protein, then it will rotate and release the molecule inside the cell. Once the molecule is touching the transport protein, it will rotate immediately. The transport protein will rotate. Here you can see it is rotating. This part came to this side, it rotates and then turns around and then transport that protein inside the cell, that molecule inside the cell. This is the best example for the water channels. Now here it is made up of 8 different types of water channels called as aquaporin. That's what I said now. This plasma membrane contains special porins called as aquaporins. Okay, this figure also shows about the facilitated diffusion. Like here we'll study about the 3 types of movement here. That means the carrier protein will allow the diffusion only if 2 types of molecule are moving together, right? Only 2 types of molecule. In this case, then 3 possibilities are there. 3 different types of movement will happen, that will occur. So let us study what are they. Now first you see here is uniport movement, right? Uniport. Now in this case, when a molecule moves across the membrane independent of the other molecules, without depending on the other molecules. Uni means single, right? This type of process is called as uniport. Okay, this can be seen in case of the fructose, which is absorbed in the small intestine single, that is alone, it is absorbed in the small intestine and gets converted to glucose, right? I hope it's clear. Next, here is antiport. Next here is antiport. Now here you see that the molecules, both the molecules are crossing the membrane in opposite directions. One is crossing this side and the other is crossing the other side. Anti means opposite. So 2 types of molecules are moving or crossing the membrane in opposite direction, right? This can be seen in case of stomatal opening. Stomatal opening, where the hydrogen and potassium ions will move in both opposite directions. Okay, I hope it's clear. So antiport, this type of process is called antiport. The last one is the symport, where both the types, where both the molecules are moving or crossing the membrane in the same direction. See here, though both of them are moving in the same direction, and hence this process is called as symport. Now this can be seen in case of sodium and glucose co-transportation. Like together they will travel in the absorption of small intestine. Sodium as well as glucose. So they will undergo the process of symport. Right? Hope this is clear. This was about the facilitated diffusion. Now there is also a role of inhibitor in this process. Right? So that it can control the phenomena or the process. Next, we will move on for the active transport, right? Now, active transport, in the sense here, energy is required. And active transport means, active means energy is required. When energy is required, hence ATP is also used, right? When energy is used, then ATP is used. So, how In this case, how the transport is? Transport is from the lower concentration to the higher concentration. See, from down to up. That is from the lower to the higher concentration. So this kind of reaction is called as uphill reaction. This kind of reaction is called uphill reaction, as the movement of molecules are from the lower concentration to the higher concentration. Right. And for the transport of molecules, pumps are required. Like in the same how the carrier proteins are required, here the pumps are required for transport of molecules. And these pumps contains the energy spending proteins. What they contains? They are the pumps are nothing but they are the proteins, right? That will use the energy so that they can carry the substances across the cell membrane. Okay, they will use the energy to carry the molecules. Now these pumps will transport the substances from low to the high region. That means low concentration to high region, right? So saturation effect is also there. That means when all that pumps are being used to, and then transport rate will reach to a maximum. Here it is written transport rate reaches a maximum when all the protein transporters are being used or saturated. That means how many pumps are there, that many protein molecules will be transported. So number of maximum number of protein transporters when they are used, that will reach to a saturation level. That effect is there. Now because the rate of movement is dependent on the number of pumps here. How many number of pumps here, right? Like enzymes, the carrier protein is very specific in what it carries across the membrane. In case of enzymes also, it is telling that the carrier protein is very specific. It will carry only those proteins which it can carry, right? Here the inhibitor effect is also present, because the transport gets affected. When the inhibitor effect is there on the active transport, definitely the transport will get affected. Okay, and it is the fast process, and it is the active transport is the fast process than compared to the diffusion, right? I hope it's clear. Okay, now you can see the comparison of different transport processes till now what we have learned. There is the table given here. Okay, comparing the different transport mechanisms. You can see this is the table which is given here. Comparison of different transport mechanism. Now this is based on the proteins that are present in the membrane, like that are responsible for the facilitated diffusion or active transport. So here some common characters are being selected here, and they are shown whether they are saturated or whether they are responding to inhibitors, whether they require any energy, or whether they are uphill reactions or downhill reactions, right? All these, like whether they are under hormonal regulations, all these are compared here in the transport mechanisms. Now let us see how they are. In case of simple diffusion, three types we have learned here. In case of simple diffusions, first one, next is facilitated transport, and then active transport, right? Now in case of diffusion, there is no active transport, membrane proteins or carrier proteins required, whereas in case of both facilitated and active transport, we require a carrier protein. Okay, right? Okay, next one is the highly selective. The carrier protein, if it is present, then it is highly selective to that particular molecule. So when there is no carrier proteins, so there is no topic of like selecting the molecule. Hence in diffusion there is no such process. In case of facilitated transport, yes, it is highly selective. Here also the transport proteins or the carrier proteins are highly selective. Like here, now about the saturation, right? And also here, no, diffusion is a phenomenon where there is not the required independent phenomenon, we can say. It doesn't require or doesn't depend on other molecules or other living systems. So it doesn't, saturation is also not present. Whereas in case of facilitated transport, even though it is passive transport, it has a saturation effect. In case of active transport also, it has a saturation effect. right? Because the rate of movement of particles will depend on the number of carriers in both the cases, in case of facilitated as well as in case of active. In both of the cases, the rate of movement is depending on the number of pumps or number of carrier proteins. And then uphill transport. Uphill means from lower concentration to the higher concentration. Facilitated diffusion is not a uphill reaction. It is a downhill reaction, because here the diffusion is from the higher to the lower. So it is a downhill reaction, whereas active transport is a uphill reaction, right? Now requires ATP energy. Diffusion doesn't require any ATP energy. Facilitated transport also doesn't require ATP energy, because here it is a downhill reaction. And whereas in the active transport, yes, it requires energy. Energy is used when the molecules are moving from lower concentration to the higher concentration, right? It's clear. Let's move on to the other one, that is plant water relations. Till here I hope it is clear.